And so today I'll be talking about intersectional stigma, which is a little, I think, less relevant for the projects this year than it was for some of them last year. But I think some of the methods here and some of the findings apply outside of stigma specifically and to other projects that folks are doing. So I'll talk about very briefly methodology that I use to look at daily stigma. I'll talk about the PRISM study that we did to develop the new measure of daily intersectional stigma, and then highlight some key considerations from it. So the work that I do with intersectional stigma, we do a lot of event level measurement, daily diaries, ecological momentary assessments. And the goal here is to capture the experience repeatedly over time, rather than asking folks about their experience in aggregate over a recalled period of time, which has multiple benefits. It reduces recall bias, allows you to capture with in-person variation in these state-like measures, right? Stigma is not a thing that a person has or doesn't have, that can vary very in significant ways across different contexts. And it allows you to look at micro-longitudinal effects where outcome of interest and at least one predictor are event level and differ within people. So this is something that we've been doing for probably about 10 years now in terms of looking at stigma in event level methods. But the measurement is absolutely horrible. So for folks that measure stigma, you'll already understand the ways in which responses tend to be heavily concentrated on the low end with a very significant right skew towards the higher levels. And we see that even more when you ask people daily about their experiences of stigma, that like almost everyone says that they didn't experience it at all or experienced it a little bit, and nobody ever says like, oh yeah, I had a ton of this today. So we did a project that I'll get to in just a minute to work on some of that. Apologies if these numbers are a little bit hard to see, but this is just the first study that I was involved in where we included some items focused on sexual minority stigma among a sample of sexual minority men that included both HIV negative and men living with HIV. It was about a half men of color sample, and this was collected here in New York City. The sample was men who were highly sexually active, which was defined at the time as 9 or more partners in 90 days. And as part of this study, they did a 30-day, once daily online diary, which included affective items as well as I mentioned, some items focused on sexual minority stigma. And so this was the first time that we validated what you're seeing here is within person level, gay-related stigma items. In the model below, we also have between person. So when you do event level measurement of anything, you can get the within person deviation from that person's average, as well as having that person's average level in the model. So you're looking at both dispositional experiences of stigma and state-like experiences of stigma at the same time. And so in this model, this was the first time that we showed that taking this approach of including both between person and within person's experiences of stigma, that within person experiences of stigma had contributed unique and significant variance to the model in understanding the daily experiences of positive, negative, and anxious affect. And then as part of my K, I recruited a sample of 50 sexual minority men, all living with HIV, to do the same thing, looking at HIV stigma. So looking at daily experiences of HIV stigma. And in this case, we actually also split the stigma into different types. So we had both anticipated and internalized HIV stigma on the daily basis. And here again, just showed that, at least with internalized stigma, that contributed significantly to the model over and above the between person levels of stigma that we also saw. So for internalized stigma, it was operating at both levels, between and within. So people who tended to experience internalized stigma more, as well as regardless of their normal levels, on days when a person experienced more stigma than they usually did. Both of those contributed significantly to these different forms of affect that we measured in this study. So, but these were all, like I said, with very imperfect measures. So the items that we used in both of these studies were designed for between person measurement, and we just changed the stem from like in the past 30 days to today. Did you experience XYZ? So NIMH put out this RFA several years ago called PRISM, which was designed all around intersectional stigma measurement. And so there were R21s, R34s, and R01s. And for the R21s, we funded, I think, 3 or 4 that were all focused on various measurement related projects. And ours was to take what we had done before, to optimize the day level measurement so that we weren't seeing such low responses with high skew, and also to adapt it so that we weren't looking at individual domains of stigma, but we're capturing intersectional stigma. So it was a 3-phase R21 study that started with a systematic literature review and qualitative interviews. Qualitative interviews were both with experts being general community members who themselves would experience this form of stigma because they were young sexual minority men of color, as well as experts being scholars and practitioners who work with those populations. And so we did equal numbers of interviews with both of those groups. Then from the systematic review of existing measures and those interviews, we developed a long list of potential items and then did multiple iterations of cognitive interviewing with those items. The cognitive interviewing also occurred in multiple phases. And as the last phase, people actually did a 7-day pilot of the measures before they did the cognitive interviews so that we could see how folks would respond in the cognitive interviews once they had experience using the measures for multiple days, which is what we normally would do in a design like how we were planning to use them. And then we've ended with a daily diary validation study with 150 young sexual minority men of color across the United States recruited from one of our nationwide cohort studies. So I'm going to really focus on the qualitative interviews today, just because I think the themes that we discovered are the real interesting part. I'm happy to share measures at some point if you're interested, although we haven't actually published the quantitative validation pieces yet. But we did interviews with 19 community-based and researcher academic experts about intersectional stigma and its measurement, and identified a bunch of really helpful themes, several of which we were not expecting. So we expected to go into this process recognizing that the experience of intersectional stigma would be unique at different intersections of stigma. And what that meant was we expected that we would develop a set of items that would be really keyed into the experience of intersectional stigma for Latino sexual minority men, and a different set of items for Black young sexual minority men, and a different set of items for white young sexual minority men. And that is absolutely not what we ended up doing. So the first thing that we found is that intersectional identities are inextricable. That is one of the core tenets of intersectionality as a theory and a concept. And so that was not surprising. That intersectional identities provide opportunities for both resilience and resistance. So folks didn't want us to just think about stigma, but wanted us to also think about the positive aspects that are the result of the same identities that are leading to stigma. That identity salience is context dependent and space and place are critical. This was a really important one. And then also that we needed to focus on process and not content. That was another critical one in terms of shifting the way that we were planning to do the actual measurement. And so I'll go into some quotes here to help highlight these 4 main concepts. So I'm just going to pull them up on the screen here because this is going to be a little there. So in some cases for some people, stigma experiences may be attributed to a specific identity, but that's overly simplistic. So folks, when we would ask them to talk about their experiences of stigma as a young Black sexual minority man, if they were in fact a young Black sexual minority man, we'd ask them to describe the ways in which stigma might look different for them than for a young Latino sexual minority man or for a young white sexual minority man. And people actually had a lot of trouble doing that. Oftentimes what they would describe is racism in a queer space or homophobia or sexism in a Black space or a Latino space, like a space where they were around folks that shared one of their identities, but not both of their one of their identities. So racism persists in queer spaces, and that has a strong effect on people's identities. Even when you order your own identities, which some people do and some people don't do. Some people are like, I am one whole, and some people are like, I am Black first, or I am queer first, and then like this other identity of mine comes second after that. And so people have to recognize that other aspects of your identity can have an impact on your other identities. And the way that we experience the world is a result of all those identities being intersected. Because of the intersecting identities that they hold, the social locations they hold, that stigma can happen. So we shouldn't promote the idea that someone being only one part of themselves. So people like really didn't want us to continue this trend of asking them about their experiences of sexual minority stigma or their experiences of racism without acknowledging that those things are not independent of the other forms of stigma that they experience on a daily basis. Less of a surprise in terms of resilience and resistance, people felt that focusing on the negative impacts of stigma provided an incomplete picture of them and of stigma's impact. So one of the participants said, the people that I'm closest with in my strongest relationships came out of shared stigma. Even if it wasn't something I was personally stigmatized against, there's a sense of camaraderie. Shared intersections of stigma, I feel like, is linked to community, solidarity, friendship, and a shoulder to cry on. Stigma is a beautiful glue. Which was very nice. This one was really critical to our thinking. Identity salience is context dependent and space and place are critical, which of course we knew, but like the measurement of stigma hadn't quite gotten to this place yet of acknowledging this within the actual measures. So there was a tension between racial, ethnic, and sexual identities in some situations. And intersectional stigma has to do with how a person interacts with not just other people, but the environment. So a lot, as a social psychologist, a lot of the tradition of studying stigma is about stigma in social interactions with other people. But the participants here really highlighted the ways in which not just people, but places can create the experience of stigma for them. They didn't actually have to interact with another person to experience stigma. I will also highlight that a lot of these interviews were done during COVID, during the COVID lockdown. So, people at this point were in some cases having to think about the days in which they actually went to places because they couldn't go places during these interviews. But nonetheless, that is like a limitation of these data, is that we did collect a lot of these interviews. Not immediately in the beginning of COVID, but like over the summer after COVID started. Things were like starting to open back up, but people were also still very hesitant. And that also came up in some of the interviews, which I'm not sharing here on the slides, but there was this sense of like,
2020.
Yeah, 2020. So there was this sense of like not being able to disentangle. Well, it was 2020, 2021, but the interviews were, qualitative interviews were 2020. Yeah. There was also this sense of like COVID stigma and not being able to differentiate whether you were being stigmatized because someone thought you might have COVID or because of one of your identities. But that's just an aside. So having the capital to go to spaces that may be more accepting than others, or the resources or access to support or express yourself or feel you can be who you are. Another participant said, we take publicness and public space for granted. But minority people who sit at intersections, these kinds of privileges of walking or traveling, or even the notion of public space, doesn't seem that they have the privileges or rights to. Public space is made for men, straight, white, gender conforming. It is embedded in who we understand is deserving of those spaces. This became a key thing in our measurement of stigma and the scales that we ultimately developed, is the idea of safe spaces as a form of privilege. That for folks that live at the intersection of multiple marginalized social positions, there are no safe spaces because there are no spaces dedicated to people at all of those intersections at the same time. So they can find spaces that are safe for one of their identities, maybe two of their identities, but there is no safe space for them that takes into account their whole selves. And then process and not content. Intersectional stigma measurement should take into account not just how stigma looks or how often it happens, but how it becomes part of a person's narrative. So this is more about like the impact of stigma being the thing that should be measured, as opposed to the content of stigma or the frequency of stigma. So speaking from a personal perspective, we are not unidimensional. We have multiple identities, and stigma can be experienced differently at different points in life, which was great rationale for why we do this daily measurement of stigma, but also really pointed to the idea that maybe we can't capture stigma just in the items of a scale. So this forced us to think a lot about the ways in which we might need to think about the associations between variables as an index of stigma, not just a score on a scale, but the association of a score on a scale with something else. That might actually be where the stigma is, because that is where the process of the impact of stigma becomes evident. So not just a score on a scale, but the association between different concepts.
Just a quick question because of our earlier conversation. How did you define stigma?
So I would have to pull up the qualitative interview guide because we define stigma so many different ways during the process. So in the qualitative interviews, we did less definition because that was part of what we were asking people is like, define stigma, tell us what it means. Stigma is intersectional. How do you experience that? So in these interviews, we did much definition of stigma. Then for the scales, let me just see what my next, actually stay here. So for the scales, what we ended up doing is we developed one scale that was, so we decided based on these interviews not to ask people to attribute experiences to their stigmatized identities. So attribution was one of the things that people hated about stigma measurement. They did not like being asked to attribute a negative experience to this or that identity and to assume what another person was stigmatizing them for, but they nonetheless felt like it was stigma. They were being stigmatized as a person. They couldn't tease apart which of their identities it was for, but it was nonetheless an experience of stigma for them. So we took away the attribution. So for the first two measures, we actually didn't define intersectional stigma. We didn't mention the word stigma. We asked people to talk about or not to talk about, but to respond to a series of feeling words about how they felt in the different spaces that they were in that day, and then how they felt in the different social interactions that they had that day. Like no priming of like this identity, that identity, any of your identities. And we also asked people to tell us the number of spaces they were in that day and the number of social interactions they had that day. And it was very interesting because the white sexual minority men like had no concept of like how many spaces they were in that day relative to the young men of color. The young men of color were much more used to like thinking about how many different spaces they were in because they are so used to having to switch, how they act across different spaces to ensure their own safety. That was not as true for the white sexual minority men. And just keep in mind that this is national. So these folks were not just in New York City. So we had folks from all over the country. Yeah.
Was it also focused on offline experiences? Were there any measures?
We did ask them to include digital experiences when we asked about the social interactions. That became a little confusing. Some people felt like they really wanted their digital experiences to be represented there, and other people like didn't really know how they should account for them, but we did include that in the final set of instructions. So we started by cognitive interviewing the instructions to make sure that people like got what we were asking them to do. Then we cognitive interviewed their understanding of the responses, which were the feeling words. And we had a lot more feeling words in the beginning and then started narrowing down the list and clarifying the words. And then we cognitive interviewed the responses to those feeling options, which, like the Likert type responses that we were using for those to try to make sure that they were most appropriate to actually capture the type of variability that could be experienced across a day. Right? Like we're not asking people about the variability in their experiences over a month. We want to know about a day. And so we want to be able to see some days are higher than others. What are the response options to these feelings that are going to get us actual variability in those experiences?
So they were real, it seemed, at least from some of your quotes, that were really distinguishing stigma from victimization, harassment, and discrimination. Or were they not? Because a lot of them are like, this one's talking about identities, right? And I'm just, for me, I mean, because we've been doing research on harassment, discrimination on and offline. And it's been difficult to even define victimization, harassment and discrimination, trying to figure out what that means to different people. So I'm just wondering, have you now defined stigma in relationship to those other experiences, or part of one thing?
Yeah, I would say it's all part of one thing. The nice thing about this switch is that it acknowledges that stigma lives in systems as opposed to in the people. So like switching away from asking people about their experiences to the way that spaces and social interactions
I see.
made them feel,
I see.
put the blame on the spaces and the social interactions and took it out of them, which was another positive benefit of removing the attribution and the experience element. So we didn't ask them about their experiences. And then the next step is that we will look at the association of these scales with their daily affective experiences. And that's where we're expecting, like I said, to see the process piece come out of it. So the hypothesis is that white sexual minority men who are not experiencing intersectional stigma, they're really technically only experiencing one axis of stigma, may not actually respond differently to the stigma scales where we ask them, where we don't actually specifically ask them about stigma, where we just ask them how they felt in their spaces and social interactions that day, but that the negative feelings in those spaces and social interactions, they may not be more common for the young sexual minority men of color, but they will be more strongly tied to their emotions that day, because they won't be able to then navigate into a safe space to ameliorate that negative impact, for example. So it's really, we're going to be looking at the slopes as the measure of stigma, basically, since we didn't specifically ask about stigma in the items. So it's like this slope as a outcome type of, we did keep one version. So we have 3 different scales that we developed. One is the spaces and places, one is the social interactions. And then we kept a version that was like literally asking about experiences of discrimination and stigma that was based off the everyday discrimination scale. And as a stigma researcher, knowing that the everyday discrimination scale has been the basis of almost all of the stigma literature, we were still getting so much feedback on that measure in the 4th round of cognitive interviewing that we just had to give up. We had to say this is the final version, even though people they didn't get it. They didn't get it. They didn't know how to respond to it. They were frustrated by it. They didn't like being asked to attribute it to specific identities or not, but also just the wording of the questions. They didn't understand them. They were too complex. They couldn't count the number of experiences, right? So you're also supposed to
right, I know.
Quantitatively, and they struggled with that. So yeah, that made me very. So we do have a modified version of those items that is the best we could reach based off of our cognitive interviews. But even in that final round where the other 2 measures, we were getting really no additional feedback, we were still getting feedback for the everyday discrimination scale based items.
And then highly correlated with are they highly correlated with the other 2 scales?
We have only actually so far focused on the other 2 scales because the everyday discrimination scales based off the everyday discrimination scale were terrible at the day level.
I see.
Because people
No
just
reliability.
on a daily basis,
Yeah.
luckily, are not
Right.
experiencing that many
Yes.
instances of overt discrimination.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
So we did,
question made me think about children and bullying. Because when this person said different points of life, I thought, oh, so how would children maybe describe, would school be considered if they get bullied, an environment where they're not safe because they get stigmatized for being nerdy or being not it's just.
yeah, and the instructions prime them on how to think about spaces and places. So we were think about different neighborhoods as different spaces, think about different offices where you work, different
Right.
places in the office might be different spaces depending on how you feel in them. It might be the whole office is one space. It might be that there are different, or like, you know, classrooms in a school, like maybe all of them feel like just school, or maybe the gym doesn't feel the same as the classroom, or, you know, those types of things. So the instructions for these quantitative measures do a little bit of that, like priming people on how to think about a space and a place.
So this is externalized stigma and then affect related to externalized, but not, they wanted to avoid internalized stigma. Is that what you're saying?
We decided not to try to tease apart internalized versus anticipated, again, to place the stigma back in the structures in which it originates, as opposed to trying to tease apart the ways that it manifests within the person, all of which
Right.
are bad. So
Mhm.
we just decided that that wasn't an important part of the question for this
Mhm.
scale. So some ethical considerations that participants raised as part of this, because, you know, this is a common question in stigma research. It's like, is the stigma research stigmatizing people? Is it making things worse? So participants wonder, who are you? This is a participant saying this. Participants wonder, who are you? How do you relate to me? Why should I share with you? What is this data going towards? Is it to elevate a PI's career, or is it to implement policy and interventions that will ultimately help the communities we're working with? Understanding the emotional impact for someone of talking about an experience for which they didn't have language. What is the aftermath of these questionnaires? How can we avoid re-traumatizing people? So people develop the activity to these scales. They may not have been as aware of their stigmatizing experiences before doing a stigma scale. Then all of a sudden you're asking them these questions. And in this case, we're asking them every day for a series of days. They learn to actually monitor for stigma even better. So like, what are the traumatizing impacts of actually doing this research? And then another participant said, get community members involved and stakeholders who embody the lived experiences we are trying to capture before developing it. So make sure that the teams are informed by the people that you are hoping to work with. So key considerations for intersectional stigma research. Sorry, this slide is so small. For daily and event level studies, avoid a focus on extreme experiences. That's kind of like a no-brainer. You don't want to bother including items that are going to maybe happen once or twice over the entire observational period, because you just will end up dichotomizing that anyway. Avoid trying to tease apart identities or isolate a driving factor. This really pointed to stigma as being the as a person's experience of stigma being a valid outcome, as opposed to needing to always be the predictor of something. Right? So like the stigmatizing systems are what need to be changed. Studying stigma as experienced by a person is an outcome. Like that we should be thinking about that more as an outcome. People were very frustrated that this is often like the way that we explain something else, but actually they wanted us to like basically focus on the fact that like, I'm experiencing this. This is unpleasant for me and it's coming from outside of me. So place the lens back on the systems that are generating these experiences. Quantifying stigma should go beyond tallying up the frequency and range of experiences. Add a focus on both positive and negative responses to stigma, which we did. We had both positive and negative feeling terms. The interesting thing, which isn't that interesting because this happens all the time when people try to do reverse coded items, they actually came out as two totally different factors. So the positively worded feelings are not reverse coded versions of stigma. They're actually a totally different construct. So like probably, you know, you would think about it as resilience, stigma resistance or stigma resilience. It's not like those in the factor analysis just came out negatively coded, but loading onto the same scale. Consider not just social interactions, but also relations to spaces and places. A general sense of safety and belonging within spaces is an experience of privilege. That was a really key one. And in one of the articles for today that was led by Tamara Taggart, we talked about conceptualizing spaces and places as a key way of measuring stigma quantitatively, right? Because all of this was also, I'm very quantitative in my work. And so all of this is really about how do we take what we learn from all the amazing qualitative intersectional stigma research and apply it in these very large national studies so that we can inform policy and practice, since those tend to be very biased towards large quantitative studies in terms of what they consider. Consider indirect capture of intersectional stigma. Do we even need to ask people to think of their stigmatized identities? They are already very well trained to think of their stigmatized identities. They can barely avoid them, as is like quite obvious from the quotes that they shared. So it's really not necessary in our stigma items to actually ask people to think about themselves as stigmatized people. And that intersectional stigma as the association and not the variable. So
What does that mean?
that's like this slope as an outcome type of model, which you can only do in within person designs. You couldn't do this if you had just like cross-sectional data on people. But when you have these multiple measurements within people, you can look at the association between different variables within people and model the variability of those across people. And I would love to thank all of the participants who volunteered their time and perspectives for this, all of my amazing collaborators, and the NIH and Dr. Greg Greenwood, who supported the study.
Whoops. Okay, I'll use that. All right.
You might be able to use the keyboard now.
Oh, okay. All right. So here's just a brief summary of what these MRPs illuminated. And it was just, it's not all the MRPs, but the ones that I thought fit together as a story. So first of all, they identified distrust and stigma-related barriers to research participation and scientific validity. So what I forgot to say is the whole point of this study was, overview, was to look at comments that they had from their participants that really spoke about how research is a context that can exacerbate stigma. So I think it fits in a lot with what Joan was thinking, talking about in terms of environmental stigma. So we as research are a context of potential stigma. And so that's what all these things are about, and they mix with trust. So identify distrust and stigma-related barriers to research participation, scientific validity, identify bias in research designs that compromise trust and exacerbate external internalized stigma, and provide data to guide the development of compassionate and destigmatizing ethical and data collection procedures. So I think their research points to this. So I'm only I looked at two kind of sets of research, those that our fellows had conducted with women involved in sex work, and you'll see that there's another group. So these are all, most of these are international. I think they're all international studies. So I think this really, points to the contextual nature and how we contribute to it, because as this woman from Peru talked about, if nothing else, the researchers treated me as a human being. So a lot of these are kind of poignant. Okay, so one of them is this fear of stigma, which really women involved in sex work are very frightened of in terms of not only their own work as somebody who does sex work, but also what does it mean to get, to be HIV positive in that profession. So embarrassment is the worst enemy women. That was one of the quotes from Guatemala. Okay, and here this person said, I was afraid I had never participated in such interviews and never signed on any paper before. I was with fear my story would be given to the newspaper and people would know about me. So I think there's two things here. One is, they are afraid about their sex work as well as their potential HIV status, but also this confusion. This is what has always gotten me. We do all this informed consent and they don't believe it, they don't hear it, you know what I mean? Like Paula is saying, and they think it might be given to the newspaper. So it's really, I think, a challenge for us in terms of what we're actually communicating to people. I really love this quote. The three fears that kill women. They fear being singled out by society, that the husband may find out, and that being HIV positive or carriers of a disease. Okay, gives me chills. All right, so what about how they feel about consent? So I love this one. Being informed of consent helps make me feel better, but does not make me completely trust you, right? And we saw that before, right? And so here's some advice. Discuss our rights at the beginning so we know what to do if the interviewer fails to follow what we have discussed, especially if they are from the clinic or city hall. So I find this very interesting too, because this is in the Philippines, and I think in a lot of countries, there is this mix between the permission, the legalization of sex work, the public health, that some of them have to go and get tested every month or something like that. And so it's difficult for them to distinguish between you're doing research, but we're really not distinguished from the government. And so they're kind of right in terms of getting permission.
I think you'd hear this a lot more now here than you would. I think that our level of institutional distrust has probably approached the Philippines at this point, and you hear something similar,
Wow.
even though that sounds very alien from the time that they did that study.
Yeah. Wow.
It's like everyone trying to shake you down, right?
Yeah,
Maybe they're supposed to, but you never know what the
Yeah.
person sitting in front of you agenda is.
exactly. Okay, and now this one also, for those of you who don't work with people involved in sex work, is that for many of them, they have to get permission from the brothel owner or they're in trouble, right? And we really need to know that if you're going to do that research. So this one is saying, I do need permission. Now here, what's the issue here with autonomy? What is autonomy when you're going to somebody's boss to ask them whether or not they can participate in an HIV study? Yes.
So when working with people who are staying in recovery houses, they have to get permission from the recovery house for that time out to come to do the research at your place. So that's just bringing it to the
Yes, interesting. Okay, think about that depending on one's context, right? And what that means, because remember that NBAC, I think it was NBAC, had this, book or whatever it was on an international research. And one of the guidelines was it's okay to ask the male person, whether it's a father, a brother, an uncle, I would say to allow a woman to be in a study, as long as you also protect her autonomy. Okay, because in these situations, some of these women can't say no if the brothel owner says yes. So this is problematic. Problematic for us. Do we not do the research? That's the question. Do you not do the research? Is compromise ethical in these situations when the women can't really say no? Because if it's an HIV and you're providing them like a Brandon, I don't know who this one was, Guatemala, this was Shira, but in Brandon's study, they were actually providing HPV, and so that was great for the brothel owner because they were providing treatment. So I think this is a big ethical dilemma for us, because otherwise they're, research orphans.
The question is not if they say no, it's if they say yes, right? Like, in other words, you're talking about the brothel owner coercing.
Yeah, exactly. So they're not allowed to say no. Well, it's both. It's
Yeah.
both. They're coerced. Exactly. They are coerced. You're absolutely right. Okay, so the next one is, so these were really interesting quotes about how disrespectful research team members were. And so I think this really says, if you're training people, make sure they're respectful, or that they keep boundaries, by the way. I think, that's another problem. But so sometimes we don't want to come because they accuse us of sex work. And I think what she meant here in the word accuse was that they're very negative about, they're biased against, you're just a sex worker, And then here, the research would make women sit in a group and ask, do you have HIV? Do you go to CD4? Test, how long have you been in the sex work? And this was in a group. And many of them, as I didn't do these studies, but, when our, this one was from Liz Reed, when they would report it to us and at RETI, a lot of these women felt that these questions would never be asked to any other women than sex workers. So once again, I think it's really important to think about the context and what we're doing to people when we're assuming we can ask certain questions just because they exist in a certain context. And here, that if we're not sensitive, then the validity of the data is challenged. And I'll talk about that again. We aren't so open to say the truth. If you ask if I have oral sex, I feel ashamed that the interviewer will know. So I don't say that. So again, I think, part of the question is how do we ask questions that really get at things in a way that's respectful and trusting, not stigmatizing, and how do we empower? So here is examples of that they perceived exploitation as well as response validity. If the researcher talks to us only for their salaries, if they say, I'm asking this, so you have to answer this, naturally, we will think of giving false responses, thinking that they are working only for the money. So stigmatizing, biases, stigmatizing of the research team can really affect the validity of the studies. And this is similar. We'll only tell our problems only when they talk affectionately to us. But we can do goodwill by destigmatizing sex work. And here, I think that's Shira, but at this point, I can't recognize anybody in pictures, and I don't remember. But you'll meet Shira, so you'll let me know. You help us a lot because we mostly don't talk to other fellow workers. If in you, we find a different piece of advice, we find consolation in talking to someone. So we can empower if we do it the right way. All right, so this was from the MRP studies that were looking at stigma and distrust in research involving men at risk for living with HIV and addiction. I think too, there's such a poignant statement, really, that we are their neighbors too. And it's really talking about the context in which they're not accepted, really like what John was talking about in terms of these spaces that they don't seem invited to. So this really is more on distrust, but has to do with us, right? Researchers they're talking about, they've been doing us dirty for a long time. They don't agree, they don't like us, but they like the pharmaceutical companies worse. I think that you found that in your original study, right? They may not trust the researchers online, but they trust the companies less. But they think that all of them are exploitative. And here this was they're only recruiting us because we're hot right now. In a few years, they will have a new focus and it'll be like, what happened to the Black gay men with HIV? So, I think that's very important. And unfortunately, we are driven by NIH announcements, so part of it is that, we also are in some sense tied to, and I remember one time I was doing, research, focus groups with African-American parent advocacy group. And, we were talking about research, blah, blah, blah. And, they were saying to me, I said to them, good, look at me, I'm independent, I'm a researcher, I'm doing these things. And they said, Dr. Fisher, you're an agent of the government. You are, you're coming in bragging about the fact that this is funded. Well, it's funded because you're an agent of the government doing what the funding announcement was asking you to do. So that's really stayed with me, depressingly so. Okay. And now screening, this is the other thing. The researcher tells us it didn't work out for you and I can't tell you why. It feels like exploitation because I can't even give you an answer and it's just like I used you. So I think we have to also be very careful about inclusion, exclusion criteria. I think a lot of us may tell people, but that also can be stigmatizing because you're trying to imagine why I was eliminated. We once did a study and it was with African-American bisexual and lesbian women who have sex with men. So, and what we found that Reddit started, trying to guess who were included and who wasn't included in our studies. There was all these Reddit things on, which was really interesting. All right. Okay. So here you can see from the comments. In order for me to trust you, I have to feel like you have walked similar spaces that I have, so you can understand where I'm coming from, which really speaks to community research workers as useful. But of course, in addiction, we also have to worry about them because asking these questions can cause a relapse and cravings. Now, this was Berto, who you'll also meet. let's see, the person that gave me the coupon told me about the study. I've known him for years and I trust him. So when he told me about it, I thought, why not? So here, this is somebody who's been respectful and compassionate. I love this one, although I can't see it. It's it's the wrong question to ask. How can we get Black folks to trust these white researchers to come and give us their personal information or whatever that says? I love this. The question really should be, how can we get more Black researchers?
Oh, Dangerfield.
Yes. Okay, so here's something else that a couple of our RETIs we're studying is that sometimes our inclusion criteria is stigmatizing. So as this person says, I don't even identify as gay, it's not who I am. This is from Randy's project in Oklahoma of men in Oklahoma. Here's another one. Okay, so this really, you know, for those of you who live in New York or other cities in which you're on the subway and you see all these ads, be in this study for HIV or be in this study for drug or come to treatment. If I see an ad for HIV research on a train or on the bus, you know, that it's targeted within a certain group, it doesn't feel like, okay, wow. Talk about context. It may put ideas in their friends' heads. We're still talking about the subway signs. Well, I see that it says HIV and they're recruiting for gay men. So obviously either all gay men have HIV or they're at a higher risk.
I love that
I know.
connection of, it's not direct, but what is the association of ideas that happens in the public mind that we don't take into consideration?
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Okay. And so a lot of times we don't think that stigmatized populations have families and that what we're doing may impact how they feel about their families. As this man said, I have my daughters and they don't know their dad is an addict. I didn't want to have my picture in a magazine or on TV and where my daughters can see me. And then this young man, this young boy actually in Thailand, being gay, it's like making my parents set their hopes. They all fall apart. See, I'm the only son in the family too. Well, dad has set high hopes for me and I'll just not likely join the study at all. And that was where Lloyd was the mentor of Guatemal's first, Thomas?
Yeah,
Thomas Guatemal's. And so we were looking at the issues of guardian consent. Okay, this one is also like interesting to me because we're all doing health research, right? That's the big thing that we're doing. And in some of these studies, they were talking about some of the things we may not think about. So I don't know if an app would even, so these are people who are substance users. In Elizabeth's study, they were living with HIV and substance use. So they were testing an mHealth a mobile app that was reminding them about taking their medications. And so I don't know if an app would even help me because you send me a text saying, take your meds, but if I'm doing meth, I still won't take it. And this person said, a lot of these drugs make you very paranoid, you know who's calling and they want you to answer questions. And if I'm getting high, I don't think they would stop to answer it, which makes a lot of sense. And you know, it doesn't, and then this one also was saying the iatrogenic effect of some of these messaging, which we know about cravings, but this one was really talking about depression. When you're pushing me like that, you know, it puts me in a bad mood and I won't even bother to answer it. So it's not that we shouldn't do in health research, but we need to be thinking about some of these things. Okay, so I'm almost finished. So this is a quote that I've loved from Josselson, who's a feminist. I think she's a philosopher. But those of us who study lives are aware that we influence the lives we examine, perhaps very little, perhaps a great deal. We shiver. Okay, so I think we all have to recognize that as nice as we want to be, the power asymmetries, the power lies with us when we're working with stigmatized groups. We decide who's included. We decide how we're going to identify them and recruit them. We decide, you know, the content that we're going to put in informed consent. We're not going to put in informed consent, RIRB and the government, and we decide what's a valuable project to do, the hypotheses, all the other things, whether or not there's going to be post-test assessments, whether we're going to refer somebody or even disseminate the data. So, basically getting back to goodness of fit ethics and what we're here for is that we're really here to reduce those asymmetries, right? By seeing research through a participant lens and then designing that research so it reflects their values. So we need to develop inclusion and exclusion criteria that reflect how participants see themselves, in addition to what we know may be medically important to look at. We have to reassess how recruitment methods may exacerbate internalized stigma or reinforce social stereotypes. We have to enhance confidentiality protections through understanding what they're worried about, like those people who are worried about magazines, right? And newspapers. There's something where, not even necessarily related to, although I must say in other research that we've done and other people have done, when we disseminate our research and we've studied an individual community, people do feel like they're being identified. So we have to be thinking about that, especially what we're doing and the kind of issues that Sharon raised. We have to create informed consent procedures that adequately address what their concerns are, not just what we think their concerns are. And design interventions that's tailored to their own lived experience. So just a few research essentials. It's important to pilot participant reactions to the proposed procedures to reduce stigma barriers and increase population-tailored scientific validity and social trust. When Rich Jenkins is here and Brenda, I think, is going to be speaking about using your MRPs as pilot data for Ks, for other grants that you're going to be getting in terms of feasibility, sensitivity, that you're making measures that really reflect the populations. I thought about something that I decided to call bidirectional debriefing, which is we're telling people about what we're really doing, but we tend not to ask them to tell us what they actually experienced and whether or not it has anything to do with what we told them it was going to be about, which can also help us better tailor our studies. Obviously, we should train staff and be wary about how they're implementing things. We really have to monitor that. To avoid the fact that they may be reinforcing societal stigmas. And we need to empower our participants by creating a research enterprise that reflects their lived experience and merits their trust. So thank you to all our Institute trainees and alumni, and to Rima, who helped me with this, and to Rich Jenkins, our program officer, our community advisory boards, all the research participants.